Hey guys, how are you doing? Today, we're going to solve one of the harder SAT math problems. This one is dealing with a quadratic function. Most people would consider this hard, however, I'm going to show you how to solve this really easily. But before we start, let's start off with a quick joke to lighten the mood. How would a ghost solve a quadratic equation? Well, a ghost solves a quadratic equation by completing the scare. That's a pretty good one. Okay. First, to solve any problem, especially on the SAT, we first have to identify two things. First, what we're given. Negative x squared plus bx minus 676 is equal to 0. We're also given that b is a positive integer and the equation has no real solution. Now, what we are looking for is the greatest possible value b. Now, how would we solve this? The first thing we have to do to solve this is look at what we're given. We're given that b is a positive integer and we're given a function. But most importantly, we're given that the equation has no real solution. If you recall, the part of a quadratic equation that tells you the amount of solutions that it has is the discriminant. That's important in this case because they give us that the equation has no real solution. So that means the discriminant must equal a specific value. If you remember, from the quadratic formula, which is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. The discriminant is this part right here, or the square root. Now, this part is going to determine how many solutions the quadratic has. We know that the equation has no real solution, so this must mean the discriminant has no real solution either. Now, the only case in which the discriminant would not be a real solution, it's an imaginary solution. Now, the only way that a square root can yield an imaginary number is if you're taking the square root of a negative number, because the square root of a negative number is not real, it's imaginary. So that means that by logic, b squared minus 4ac is less than 0 by definition. Let's plug in our knowns. Upon analyzing our quadratic, we can see our a and c values. Our a value is the coefficient to the first term of the quadratic, or x squared. This is negative 1 because it's just negative x squared. So let's plug this in. B squared minus 4 times negative 1 in parentheses multiplied by the c value, which is just the constant of the quadratic equation. In this case, it's negative 676. And this is also all less than 0. How do we solve this? We know that b squared minus 4 times negative 1 times negative 676 is less than 0. So the first thing we have to do is actually multiply these numbers out. 4 times negative 1 times negative 676 is equal to 2,704. So b squared minus 2,704 is less than 0. This right here is the equation that will give us our solution. This is important. Now, how do we solve for b here? Well, the thing is, to solve for b in this case, we want to get b by itself, like you would with any algebra problem. To do this, we have to move the negative 2,704 to the other side. Because it's being subtracted, we have to add 2,704 to both sides. After doing this, we'll get b squared, and then these two simply cancel out, and then we'll just get is less than 0 plus 2,704, which is just 2,704. How do we cancel the b squared and make it just b? Well, if you recall, to cancel a square, we need to use a square root. So we'll take the square root of both sides. Once we take the square root of both sides, we'll get the square root of b squared is less than square root of 2,704. Now, these two, the b squared, specifically the squared part, and the square root, cancel each other out. So we'll just be left with b is less than the square root of 2,704. Now, the square root of 2,704 is 52. However, we have to account for the fact that the square root of 2,704 is both positive and negative when we're solving for a variable. Now, upon accounting for both possibilities, we'll get b is less than positive 52, and then b is less than negative 52. Now, how do we solve it from here? How do we know which one to choose? It says in the given equation, b has to be a positive integer. Now, because in the second equation, it says that b is less than negative 52, that means that b will be negative, because anything less than negative 52 is also negative. And since b is a positive integer, the second equation will not give us our solution. So we know that the first equation will give us our solution. We know that b is less than 52 according to our equation right here. Now, how do we know the greatest possible value of b? We know that because b is an integer, that means that it has to be a whole number. The greatest whole number that is less than 52 is just 51, and it's as simple as that. That gives us our solution to be b is equal to 51. And that's our answer. Pretty easy, right?